A rancher lived a decade alone. Until a drenched bride collapsed on his doorstep, Tom Gallagher had lived alone for 10 years. 10 long years in a small, weathered cabin on the edge of the Montana plains, far from the nearest town, far from anyone who could claim to know him. People sometimes said he was a recluse, a man who had chosen isolation over companionship, but for Tom, it wasn't a choice at first. Life had simply taken him in a direction he hadn't expected. He had once known laughter, conversation, and love, but that part of his life had ended abruptly, leaving a quiet emptiness that stretched as wide as the land around him. The cabin was small but sturdy, built by his own hands years ago. Its logs were darkened with age, and the roof had patches where he had carefully replaced the worn shingles. Inside it smelled of wood smoke, leather, and the faint tang of the animals he kept nearby. There was a worn armchair near the fireplace, a kitchen table scratched and scarred with years of use, and a bed in the corner that creaked under weight but remained comfortable enough. Every item had a purpose, every corner held a memory, and every sound outside, wind against the trees, distant cattle calls, felt like a part of a rhythm that only he understood. Tom's life had settled into routines. He woke with the sun as it rose over the endless plains, painting the sky with shades of gold and pink. He would check on his cattle first, walking among them with careful eyes, listening for any sign of illness or distress. He knew each animal by sight and by sound, and the herd, in its own quiet way, had become his family. After tending the cattle, he would repair fences that had fallen during storms, mend gates, or haul water from the nearby stream. By the afternoon, he would take a break, sometimes reading a book, sometimes sharpening tools, sometimes simply sitting outside and watching the land stretch to the horizon. Evenings were the quietest part of the day. The sun would sink behind the distant hills, turning the sky into a canvas of fiery colors. Tom would build a fire in the hearth and prepare a simple meal, usually meat, beans, or vegetables from the small garden he maintained. He ate alone, spoke only to himself or the animals, and often drifted into long thoughts about life, time, and the events that had led him here. In those quiet moments, he sometimes allowed himself to remember. He remembered the laughter of friends, the warmth of family, and especially the love he had lost. That loss was something he rarely spoke of. For those who knew him, it was enough to say that something had changed in Tom 10 years ago, something that had pushed him away from people and into the arms of solitude. People in town whispered about it from time to time. Some thought he had lost his wife, others thought he had been betrayed, but no one truly knew. Tom didn't feel the need to explain. The past was a place he visited only in memory, a quiet room in his mind that he kept closed most of the time. Despite the isolation, Tom wasn't lonely in the way people imagine. The land, the cattle, and the rhythm of his work kept him company. He took satisfaction in knowing that his chores were done well, that the fences held, that the animals were healthy. The wind that swept across the plains could be loud and fierce, but it was also comforting, a reminder that life went on beyond the walls of his cabin. The nights were clear, and on many occasions he would step outside and look up at the stars. There was a vastness in the sky that made his problems feel small, and a sense of peace that only the solitude of the plains could provide. Still, there were moments, usually in the quietest hours before dawn, when the silence became heavy, when the wind had died down, when the animals slept and the fire had turned to glowing embers. Tom would feel the absence of human connection. It wasn't a pain that could be fixed, just a subtle ache, a reminder that life once held more than work and routine. On those nights he would talk quietly to himself, or sometimes to the empty air, as if speaking might bring some echo of the world back to him. The seasons marked time, more than any calendar ever could. Winters were harsh, with snowdrifts that could reach the roof of the cabin and temperatures that froze even the bravest soul. Tom would spend those months checking on his animals constantly, breaking ice for water, feeding and protecting them from the cold. Spring brought renewal, green shoots of grass, and newborn calves that gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Summer was long, hot, and dusty, demanding endless labor to maintain fences and water supply, while autumn carried the weight of harvest and preparation for the cold months ahead. Each season had its challenges, each required attention, and each shaped the rhythm of Tom's life in ways he had grown to respect. Despite the harshness of his environment, Tom found beauty in the details. He noticed the way sunlight shimmered on the dew in the morning, the patterns of birds flying across the sky, and the quiet murmur of the stream as it cut through the plains. These small moments brought him comfort, a sense of connection to the world that went beyond people. The land itself had become a companion, steady, reliable, and forgiving in a way humans sometimes were not. Occasionally, people from the town would come to see him, bringing supplies or seeking his help with ranch work. These visits were brief, polite, and necessary, but Tom never invited company beyond what was required. He preferred the calm of his cabin, the simplicity of his days, and the freedom that came from having no one to answer to but himself. He had built a life that suited him, even if it was lonely, even if it was quiet, and even if it carried memories he could not escape. Yet, underneath it all, there was a part of Tom that had not completely given up on the idea of human connection. It was faint, hidden beneath layers of habit, grief, and routine, but it existed. The kind of life he had created allowed him to survive, to endure, and to find a certain peace, but it also left room for change, for surprises, for something unexpected to enter the quiet world he had built. And for 10 years, nothing had disturbed that stillness. Tom Gallagher had become part of the land he tended. His body carried the marks of years of labor, calloused hands, weathered skin, and muscles built from long days of work. But his mind and heart remained vigilant, aware, and quietly waiting. He didn't know what might come next, nor did he try to predict it. The plains had taught him patience, resilience, and the understanding that life moved in its own way, often without warning or explanation. And so he lived. 10 years passed like this, a life measured by sunrises, chores, storms, and starry nights. It was a life that many would have found lonely, even harsh. But for Tom, it was familiar, reliable, and, in its own way, comforting. He had survived the loss that had driven him here, built a life that honored both the past and the present, and existed quietly in a world of his own making. The wind whispered through the grasses, the cattle moved steadily in the fields, and Tom sat by his fire, staring into the flames, feeling the calm of a life built on routine and solitude. He had learned to live with silence, to embrace it, and to find in it a form of peace that few could understand. For 10 years, that had been enough. But as the sun dipped below the horizon one late autumn evening, casting long shadows across the plains, Tom felt a small, unexplainable stirring in his chest, a hint that perhaps the life he had built, strong and solitary as it was, might one day be interrupted in the most unexpected way. And little did he know that interruption would come sooner than he ever imagined. The day had started like any other for Tom Gallagher. He rose with the sun, checking the cattle, fixing a broken fence post, and making sure the water troughs were full. The wind had been calm that morning and the sky clear, a pale blue stretching across the horizon. By midday, though, a change had begun to creep in. Clouds gathered slowly, like a curtain being drawn across the sky, and the air felt heavier, carrying the scent of distant rain. Tom had seen storms come from miles away before. The plains had a way of announcing them early, with sudden gusts of wind or the first drops of rain that smelled earthy and sharp. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had thickened into a dark gray ceiling, and the wind had begun to stir more violently. Tom felt it in his bones, a restless tension that made the hair on his arms rise. He walked to the barn to secure the tools and make sure the animals were safe. The cattle huddled together, uneasy, their low moos blending with the sound of the wind. Even the horses seemed on edge, stamping their hooves and flicking their tails. Tom moved among them calmly, speaking in soft tones, guiding them to shelter, making sure every animal was accounted for. The storm wasn't here yet, but he could sense its approach like a shadow moving across the land. By late afternoon, the first drops of rain fell, light at first, but steady, splattering against the wooden roof of his cabin. Tom listened as the rhythm grew louder, the wind howling through the gaps in the logs, tugging at the doors and rattling the windows. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the wide plains in brilliant, jagged streaks. Thunder followed, rolling across the sky with a force that shook the ground beneath his feet. The storm had arrived, and it was moving fast. Tom went inside, lighting the fireplace to keep the cabin warm. He tended to his chores quickly, making sure everything outside was secure. The rain now fell in sheets, drumming on the roof like 1,000 tiny hammers. He could barely see past the edges of his property, the world outside reduced to a blur of gray and white. The wind whistled through the trees and across the plains, carrying with it a chill that made the small cabin feel like a fragile sanctuary in the middle of chaos. As the storm raged, Tom felt a familiar thrill of respect for its power. He had lived in the plains all his life, and storms like this reminded him that nature was unpredictable, that the world could change in an instant, and that survival required attention, patience, and courage. He poured himself a cup of strong coffee, sitting by the fire, watching the rain lash against the windows, listening to the roar of the wind, feeling the weight of the solitude he had embraced for so long. Then came a sound that stopped him in his tracks. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but unmistakable, a knock at the door. One sharp, desperate knock, almost a plea. Tom froze. the cup of coffee trembling in his hands. Who could be out there in this storm? The nearest house was miles away, and few people would dare to travel in weather like this. For a moment he considered ignoring it, letting whoever it was face the storm alone. But something in the sound, a fragility, a fear, made him move. He opened the door cautiously. The wind and rain rushed inside, drenching him instantly, and there she was, a young woman, collapsed on his doorstep, soaked from head to toe, her hair plastered to her face, and a white dress clinging to her body. Her eyes were wide, filled with shock and exhaustion, and she shivered uncontrollably. She looked as if she had been running for hours, or perhaps even longer, and her presence seemed impossible in this remote place. Tom instinctively reached out, steadying her, and she leaned heavily against him, too weak to stand on her own. He guided her inside, shutting the door against the wind and rain. The cabin suddenly felt warm and safe, though the storm still raged outside. She sank into the armchair by the fire, shivering, and Tom went to grab a thick blanket. Her lips were pale, her teeth chattering, and the look in her eyes told him she had faced something frightening, something she had tried to escape. He wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and fetched a cup of warm water, handing it to her gently. She took it with trembling hands, sipping slowly as she tried to regain some composure. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The storm filled the silence, punctuated by occasional flashes of lightning and rumbles of thunder. Tom studied her carefully. She looked young, maybe in her early 20s, and though her dress was ruined by the rain, it was clearly a wedding gown. The image struck him strangely. Here was a bride, far from any ceremony, alone, lost, and terrified. He wondered what had driven her to this moment, and why she had ended up on his doorstep, in the middle of nowhere, in the midst of a storm. Finally she spoke, her voice barely audible above the wind. I don't know where else to go," she said, her words trembling. "Please, I need help." Tom nodded, understanding that there was no one else she could turn to. He poured another cup of water, then took off his wet jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth of the cabin and the fire seemed to soothe her slightly, though the fear in her eyes remained. As she began to regain a small measure of strength, Tom asked carefully, "What happened? How did you end up out here in this storm?" She hesitated, glancing toward the window where the rain fell in relentless sheets. Her hands twisted the edge of the blanket. Her cousins buried his feet. I ran away from my wedding," she whispered. I couldn't go through with it. I didn't know what else to do, and then the storm came." Her voice faltered, and she looked down, embarrassed and exhausted. Tom nodded slowly. He didn't speak judgment. He had learned long ago that life didn't come with easy answers. Some things had to be faced in their own time. "You're safe here," he said simply. "Sit by the fire or warm up. Drink some water. We'll figure out the rest later." She nodded, too drained to argue. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone had come into his cabin who needed him, not just his hands, but his presence, his care, and his attention. The storm continued to rage outside, fierce and relentless. Lightning lit the sky, followed by the deep roll of thunder. Rain fell in torrents, drenching the land, turning the plains into a blur of gray and water. The wind howled like a living thing, bending trees and tossing loose debris. Tom could feel the raw power of nature pressing against the thin walls of his cabin, yet inside there was warmth, safety, and a quiet tension that neither of them could ignore. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time seemed strange when the storm filled every sound. She slowly began to speak, telling him bits and pieces of her story, though haltingly. Her family had arranged her wedding, she said, and she couldn't accept it. She didn't want to hurt anyone, but she couldn't go on with a life that felt wrong, a life that had been chosen for her. Tom listened without interrupting, allowing her to speak freely, knowing that trust was fragile in moments like these. By nightfall, the storm showed no sign of relenting. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls. Tom had set her up with a dry towel and another blanket on the sofa bed. She had begun to relax slightly, her shivering subsiding, though her eyes still held that haunted, fearful look. Tom sat across from her, watching her carefully, feeling a strange mix of curiosity, concern, and something he hadn't felt in years. The sudden awareness that his quiet life, so carefully structured for 10 years, might be about to change in ways he hadn't imagined. The storm outside became a kind of backdrop to their first encounter. The roaring wind, the relentless rain, and the flickering lightning created a sense of urgency, a reminder that this moment, this meeting, was extraordinary. Tom had always known that life could surprise you, but he had spent the last decade avoiding surprises. Now, with a drenched bride on his doorstep, he realized that surprises could be beautiful, frightening, and life-changing all at once. As the night stretched on, they sat quietly, listening to the storm. Occasionally, she would glance toward the window as if expecting the world outside to disappear with the rain, and occasionally, Tom would offer her simple reassurances. "You're safe here. The storm will pass. You're not alone." Those words, simple as they were, seemed to offer a fragile comfort. In that small cabin, amidst the fury of the storm, a connection began to form, one that neither of them could have predicted, yet both instinctively recognized. By the early hours of the morning, the storm began to weaken. Rain still fell, but less violently, and the wind had eased. The plains outside were wet and glistening under the pale light of the moon breaking through the clouds. Tom watched her sleep for a few moments, peaceful for the first time that night, and felt a strange sense of hope. The storm had brought her to him, and though he did not yet know what tomorrow would hold, he understood that their lives had been forever altered by one desperate knock on a door. And as he stared into the dying embers of the fire, Tom Gallagher realized that the quiet, solitary life he had built over 10 years might no longer be enough. The world outside was still wild, unpredictable, and full of storms, but inside that cabin, he felt, for the first time in years, the possibility of something entirely new. The morning after the storm, the first rays of sunlight crept through the small cabin window, casting warm light across the wooden floor. Tom Gallagher was already awake, as usual, moving quietly so as not to disturb the young woman who had spent the night in his cabin. She was still asleep, wrapped in the blanket he had given her, and her wet hair had dried into soft waves around her face. For a moment, he simply watched her breathe steadily, noticing the tension in her features beginning to ease. In all his years of solitude, he had never had anyone like this in his cabin. Someone who was not family, not a worker, not a friend, but a stranger in need who had been brought into his life by chance. He began his morning chores, moving carefully so as not to make too much noise. He checked the cattle, refilled the water troughs, and inspected the fences damaged in the storm. The land smelled fresh from the rain, the grass gleaming with tiny drops that sparkled like diamonds in the sun. Even in the quiet, he felt a sense of alertness he hadn't felt in years, as if the presence of the young woman had awakened something dormant within him. For a decade, he had been entirely self-sufficient, relying only on himself and the animals. But now he sensed that life could be more complicated, and perhaps more meaningful than he had allowed himself to believe. When he returned to the cabin, she was awake, sitting by the fire with her knees pulled up to her chest wrapped in the blanket. Her eyes met his, wide and cautious, but there was a trace of relief there, too. He offered her a warm smile and a cup of strong coffee. She accepted it with both hands, taking a small sip and sighing softly as the warmth spread through her. "Thank you," she said quietly. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't opened the door," Tom nodded, setting his own cup down. "You're safe here," he said. "No one will hurt you. You can stay as long as you need." She hesitated, glancing around the cabin, taking in the simplicity of his life. I don't even know how to explain what happened," she admitted. Her voice was fragile, carrying the weight of a story she had barely begun to tell herself. Tom gestured for her to sit more comfortably, and she lowered herself into the armchair, letting the blanket fall around her shoulders. "Start wherever you can," he said. "I'll listen." For a long while she remained silent, staring into the fire as if searching for the right words. Then, slowly, she began to speak. "My name is Emily," she said. I was supposed to get married yesterday." Her voice caught slightly and she swallowed hard. "It was an arranged marriage. My parents, they chose him. I barely knew him and I couldn't go through with it. I couldn't pretend to be happy when I was terrified inside." Tom listened carefully, nodding but saying nothing. He understood fear. He understood being trapped by circumstances beyond one's control. He had lived through his own loss, his own moments of helplessness, and though the details were different, he could feel her fear, her confusion, her desperation. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," Emily continued, "but I had to get away. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. I ran, and then the storm came, and I didn't know what would happen next." Her voice trembled, and she buried her face in her hands for a moment. Tom gently placed a hand on hers, feeling the small shiver that ran through her. "It's okay," he said quietly. "You did what you had to do. You're safe now. That's what matters." She looked up at him, her eyes wet with tears, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel the relief of being understood, of not having to explain or justify herself. I've never felt so scared and yet so relieved," she admitted. "I don't know why, but coming here, it feels like I'm finally somewhere I can breathe." Tom nodded, understanding completely. He knew the relief that came from finding safety after a long struggle, the quiet peace that followed a storm, whether outside or inside one's heart. He poured them both another cup of coffee, and they sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the soft crackle of the fire. As the day wore on, Emily began to relax more. She helped herself to a simple breakfast that Tom prepared, and he showed her how to make small repairs around the cabin. It was an unusual way to get to know someone, but in the quiet rhythm of chores and shared effort, a bond began to form. She laughed quietly when she dropped a tool or made a small mistake, and he smiled at her, feeling the warmth of human connection that he had not experienced in 10 long years. Gradually, she began to tell him more about her life. Her family was wealthy and influential in their town, but they were strict and controlling. She had grown up obeying rules and meeting expectations, never truly being allowed to make her own choices. The wedding had been the culmination of years of pressure, and she had finally realized she could not go on living her life according to someone else's plan. "I thought I could handle it," she said, her voice soft. "I thought I could say yes and pretend everything was fine, but I couldn't. I had to run. I had to choose myself, even if it scared me." Tom listened, nodding slowly. He could see the courage it had taken for her to leave everything she knew behind, to face an unknown path with only the hope of safety ahead. He felt a deep respect for her strength, and at the same time he felt something stir within himself, a longing, faint but undeniable, for the connection and trust that could come from sharing life with another person. The hours passed quickly. The storm had long since moved on, leaving the plains wet and glistening under the afternoon sun. The cabin, once filled only with the sound of the wind and the crackling fire, now carried the quiet hum of conversation and shared work. Emily helped him with small tasks, learning quickly how to mend fences and care for the animals. She was clumsy at first, but her determination and willingness to learn impressed him. And in those moments, the distance between their two worlds, his life of solitude and her life of expectation, seemed to shrink, bridged by effort, trust, and simple human kindness. By evening, they had settled into a routine. Emily prepared a simple dinner with guidance from Tom, and they ate together at the small kitchen table. They spoke of little things at first, the weather, the animals, the land, but gradually their conversation deepened. She shared stories of her childhood, the small joys she had found despite the pressure, and the dreams she had secretly held for herself. Tom shared stories from his own past, carefully selecting what he revealed, allowing her glimpses of the man he had been before solitude claimed him. In the quiet of the cabin, as darkness fell outside, a new understanding formed between them. Emily realized she had found not just safety but acceptance. Tom realized that he had found not just a visitor, but someone who could understand him, someone who could share in the quiet life he had built with care and resilience. The storm had brought her to his doorstep, but it was the conversations, the shared work, and the moments of honesty that began to bind them together. By the end of the evening, Emily felt a measure of peace she had not known for months. She sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, watching the flames dance, and allowed herself to imagine a life where she could make her own choices, where she could be herself without fear or pressure. Tom watched her quietly, noting the small changes in her expression, the way her shoulders relaxed, the softening of her eyes, the slight smile that appeared when she laughed at something small and silly. It was clear to both of them that this meeting was no ordinary chance encounter. The storm had brought them together, but what mattered now was how they chose to move forward. Emily could not return to the life she had left behind. Not yet, and Tom could not undo the solitude he had built over 10 years. Yet in the shared space of the cabin, amidst the warmth of the fire and the lingering scent of rain, they began to find common ground. Trust, understanding, and mutual respect were forming quietly, like the first shoots of green after a long winter. As the night deepened, Emily finally rested, knowing she was safe, and Tom sat quietly by the fire, reflecting on the events of the day. The world outside was calm now, the plains glistening under the moonlight, and the cabin was filled with a sense of quiet possibility. He realized that life, even after years of solitude, could still surprise him, and he felt, for the first time in a long while, a sense of anticipation, an understanding that this encounter, unexpected and extraordinary, might just change everything. The days that followed the storm were quieter, gentler, and filled with small, meaningful routines. Tom Gallagher and Emily settled into a rhythm that was unlike anything either of them had known. The cabin, once a space of solitude, now echoed with the sounds of two people working, speaking, and sharing moments that made the walls feel warmer, the air lighter. Tom's life, carefully constructed over 10 years, was shifting in ways he had never imagined, and he found himself observing Emily with a mix of curiosity, admiration. Emily had quickly proven herself capable even in the rugged, unfamiliar environment of the ranch. She learned how to feed the cattle, refill the water troughs, and repair fences alongside Tom. At first she was awkward, unsure of how to handle the heavy tools or the stubborn animals, but her determination was clear. She refused to give up, and Tom admired her persistence. He didn't say it aloud, but each small accomplishment she made felt like a victory not just for her, but for the quiet bond that was forming between them. Tom found himself explaining things he had never explained to anyone before. He showed her how to mend a broken gate, how to read the signs of the weather in the clouds, how to check the health of a calf. Emily listened attentively, asking questions and practicing diligently. She made mistakes, dropping a hammer, misjudging the angle of a fence post, but Tom never scolded her. Instead, he offered gentle guidance, patience, and encouragement. And slowly she began to understand the rhythm of the land, the subtle ways in which life on a ranch demanded attention, care, and respect. Evenings became a time of quiet companionship. They would sit by the fire after the day's work, sharing simple meals and talking about the world beyond the plains. Emily told stories about her childhood, about the expectations and pressures that had shaped her life, and Tom listened carefully, offering small pieces of his own story in return. They laughed at minor accidents, celebrated small victories, and began to recognize the comfort of each other's presence. The cabin, once a sanctuary of solitude, had become a place of healing, warmth, and connection. One afternoon, after a long morning of repairing a broken fence along the far edge of the property, Emily paused to catch her breath. The sun was high, the air fresh with the scent of rain-drenched grass, and the distant mountains shimmered in the heat waves rising from the plains. She leaned against the fence post, wiping sweat from her brow, and looked at Tom. "I never thought I could do this," she admitted, her voice light but honest. "I thought I would be clumsy, weak, maybe even useless out here." "You've done more than I expected," he said. "You've got strength, determination, and patience. Things you might not even realize you have." Emily smiled, a soft, genuine expression that lit up her face. I think I'm learning more about myself here than I ever have before. It's strange. At first I was terrified, and now I feel like I belong somewhere. Even if it's just a small place on a big ranch." Tom's chest tightened slightly. He understood that feeling well. He had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten the comfort of belonging somewhere, of feeling like a part of something bigger than himself. Watching Emily find her place on the ranch, he felt a mixture of pride, relief, and an unexpected warmth that he hadn't felt in years. They continued their work together, and the ranch slowly took on a new sense of life. The fences were repaired, the fields tended, and the animals cared for with careful attention. Emily began to notice details that Tom had always seen, but never spoken of. The way the wind shifted before a change in weather, the quiet patterns in the herd, the small signs of life and growth in the garden. Tom taught her to observe, to respect, and to act with both strength and patience. And in these shared tasks, a trust and partnership began to grow, unspoken but undeniable. At night, the fire became a place for reflection. They would sit quietly, sipping tea or coffee, watching the flames dance. Sometimes they spoke of the past, sometimes of the future, and sometimes of nothing at all. In the silence, there was a sense of comfort, a reassurance that neither of them had expected. Emily learned to trust Tom not only for protection, but for understanding. Tom learned to open his heart, ever so slightly, to the presence of someone who had entered his life unexpectedly, but with quiet purpose. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, Emily stood by the cabin window, watching the cattle move slowly across the wet grass. She turned to Tom and said softly, "I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like I'm finally allowed to be myself. Out here, I can breathe, I can think, I can just exist without fear." Tom nodded, understanding completely. "This place, it has a way of showing you who you are," he said. "And sometimes it teaches you more than you ever thought you'd learn." Over the following weeks, the two grew closer. Emily began helping with more than just physical labor. She learned to organize supplies, manage small repairs, and care for the animals in ways that reflected her growing confidence. Tom watched her transform with quiet admiration, noticing the subtle changes, the way she carried herself, the ease in her movements, the strength in her voice when she gave instructions or offered solutions. She was becoming not only a companion, but a partner, someone who could share the responsibilities and joys of life on the ranch. Their bond extended beyond work. They shared meals, stories, and laughter. Sometimes they would walk across the plains together, talking about the sky, the land, and the endless possibilities of life. They discussed dreams, fears, and the moments that had shaped them both. Emily discovered a resilience she hadn't known she possessed, and Tom rediscovered a capacity for care and connection that he thought had been lost to time and solitude. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by the storm, Emily paused to catch her breath. She looked at Tom, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I never imagined my life could be like this," she said quietly. "I thought I was trapped in a world I didn't belong in. But now, I feel like I've found something real, something I can hold on to." Tom glanced at her, a slow smile forming. "Sometimes life has a way of surprising us," he said. "Even when we think we're alone, even when we think the world has nothing left for us, something or someone comes along and changes everything." She reached out and touched his arm lightly, a gesture of trust and connection. "I'm glad it was you," she said. "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found you." Tom felt a warmth in his chest he hadn't experienced in years. For 10 years, he had lived alone, relying only on himself. Now, he realized that the presence of another person, someone brave, kind, and strong, could bring life and hope back into even the quietest corners of his world. As the days turned into weeks, the routines became second nature. The cabin was filled with laughter, the sounds of work, and the quiet satisfaction of shared effort. Emily was learning not only how to survive on the ranch, but how to thrive, discovering the strength within herself and the comfort of being valued and understood. Tom, in turn, was learning to open his heart again, to trust in someone else, and to appreciate the joy that came from shared life rather than solitude, even in the smallest moments. The way she carried water, the way she laughed when a calf escaped, the way she carefully mended a fence, Tom found himself noticing her more and more. The bond they shared was not one of romance alone, though there was a gentle warmth growing between them. It was a bond of mutual respect, care, and understanding, a quiet partnership that neither had expected but both had come to treasure. By the time spring approached, the ranch had transformed. The fences were strong, the animals healthy, and the land vibrant with life. Emily had grown in confidence and skill, and Tom had grown in openness and trust. Together they had created a life that was full, meaningful, and shared. The storm that had brought Emily to his doorstep seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the warmth and steady rhythm of life they now lived together. And in the quiet moments when the sun set over the plains and the fire crackled in the cabin, they would sit together, side by side, understanding without words that their lives had changed forever. The storm had brought them together, but it was the days, weeks, and shared experiences that had healed them both. They had found strength, comfort, and companionship in one another, discovering that even the most solitary life could open to connection when the right person arrived at the right time. Spring had arrived on the Montana plains, painting the land with shades of green, gold, and soft wild flowers that swayed in the warm breeze. The mornings were crisp, carrying the fresh scent of grass and soil, and the days grew longer, giving the ranchers more time to work and enjoy the calm beauty of the land. For Tom Gallagher and Emily, life had settled into a rhythm that was peaceful, productive, and full of quiet joy. What had begun as a chance encounter on a stormy night had grown into something deeper, a life shared, a bond forged by trust, effort, and understanding. Tom rose early, as he always did, checking on the cattle and ensuring the ranch was in order. But there was a difference now. Emily was there beside him, alert, capable, and ready to help. She had become not just a guest or a visitor, but a true partner in every sense. They moved together across the fields, working side by side, their actions synchronized through practice and mutual understanding. She had learned the rhythms of the ranch, and Tom had learned the comfort of sharing responsibility and effort with someone he trusted completely. That morning, as the sun rose behind the distant hills, Emily laughed softly at something a young calf had done. Tom glanced at her, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that he hadn't felt in years. He realized how much he had missed having someone to share these simple moments with, someone who could find joy in the small, ordinary wonders of the world. The plains, once vast and empty, now seemed full, alive with shared experience and companionship. After breakfast, they repaired a section of fencing that had been weakened by the winter winds. Emily worked steadily, her hands strong and sure, and Tom could not help but admire her focus and determination. "You've gotten really good at this," he said casually, though there was admiration in his voice. Emily smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I've had a good teacher," she replied, her tone teasing, but her eyes shining with genuine affection. There was a lightness between them now, a playful camaraderie that had not existed when she first arrived at the cabin. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, they took a break and sat on the porch, watching the herd move slowly across the fields. Emily leaned back, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the peace of the land. "I never thought life could feel like this," she admitted quietly. "I thought I was doomed to a life full of fear and expectation. But here, I feel free. I feel like I can finally breathe and be myself." Tom nodded, understanding completely. Freedom isn't always about leaving a place or a person behind, he said. Sometimes it's about finding where you belong, even in the simplest of places and with the right people around you. The days passed in a steady flow of work and quiet joy. Emily and Tom shared tasks, repaired equipment, tended to animals, and cared for the land together. They shared meals, conversation, and laughter, discovering a comfort in each other's presence that neither had known for years. Their bond was growing stronger with each passing day, built not on grand gestures or dramatic events, but on small acts of care, patience, and understanding. One evening, after a long day of work, Tom and Emily sat by the fire. The sun had set behind the hills, leaving the sky a tapestry of deep purples and soft oranges. Emily sipped a cup of tea, her hands warm from the mug, and looked around the cabin, which now felt more like a home than ever before. "I think this is the first place I've ever felt completely safe," she said softly. Tom looked at her, noting the gentle determination in her eyes. "You are safe," he said simply. "And not just here, but with me. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Emily smiled, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded her for months. She realized that she had found more than safety in Tom's cabin. She had found acceptance, understanding, and the beginnings of love. And she sensed that Tom, too, was discovering a depth of feeling he had thought lost forever. The following weeks were filled with small adventures and shared responsibilities. They explored the far edges of the property, checking fences, inspecting water sources, and learning the patterns of the wildlife that roamed the plains. They laughed at minor accidents, celebrated small successes, and took pleasure in the quiet, steady rhythm of life. Emily's presence had transformed the cabin and the ranch, bringing warmth, laughter, and companionship into a space that had once been defined by solitude. One day, as they sat together under a large oak tree, Emily turned to Tom with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about what life might be like beyond the ranch?" she asked. Tom considered the question carefully. "I do sometimes," he said. "But I also know that what matters most isn't where you are, it's who you're with. And right now, this is where we belong. This is home." Emily nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude and affection. "I think I understand that now," she said. "It's not about running away from the past or chasing some perfect future. It's about being present, here and now, and finding joy in the life we're creating together." As spring gave way to early summer, the ranch flourished. The fields were green, the animals healthy, and the fences sturdy. Emily had become a trusted partner in every aspect of ranch life, and Tom had discovered a new sense of fulfillment in sharing his world with someone who respected, understood, and cared for it as he did. Their connection deepened each day, strengthened by shared work, mutual respect, and the quiet intimacy of a life built together. One afternoon, while repairing a small section of fence near the creek, Emily tripped over a rock and stumbled. Tom reached out instantly, steadying her with his strong hands. She laughed softly, a little embarrassed, and he chuckled as well. "See," she said, "you've made me stronger, but I still can't escape the occasional misstep." "We all stumble sometimes," he said. "The important part is having someone there to help you get back on your feet." Emily looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the sunlight and the deep trust she felt. In that moment, she realized that she had not only found safety and purpose on the ranch, but a sense of belonging she had never known before. Tom had become more than a friend, more than a companion. He had become someone who could be trusted completely, someone with whom she could imagine a future. The weeks turned into months, and life on the ranch continued in its steady, fulfilling rhythm. Emily's skills improved, her confidence grew, and her laughter became a familiar, comforting sound in the cabin. Tom found himself opening up more, sharing memories and thoughts he had kept hidden for years, and discovering joy in the simple act of caring for another person as deeply as he had once cared for the land. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Emily and Tom sat together on the porch, watching the cattle graze in the fading light. The storm that had brought Emily to the cabin felt like a distant memory, replaced by the warmth of shared life, laughter, and companionship. Emily rested her head on Tom's shoulder, feeling a sense of peace and belonging she had never known before. I think this is exactly where I'm supposed to be," she whispered. Tom wrapped an arm around her gently, feeling the truth of her words. "You are," he said softly, "and I'm glad you're here, more than I can say." As night fell over the plains, the stars appearing in the clear, dark sky, they sat together in silence, listening to the quiet sounds of the ranch, the soft rustle of leaves, the low hum of the cattle, the distant call of an owl. Life had brought them together in the most unexpected way, but it had also given them something rare and precious, a new beginning. They knew there would be challenges ahead, as there always are in life, but they also knew that together they could face anything. The ranch, once a place of solitude for Tom, had become a home filled with love, trust, and hope. Emily, who had arrived drenched and fearful on a stormy night, had found not only safety but purpose, belonging, and the beginnings of a future she could embrace fully. And as they watched the stars glimmer above the Montana plains side by side, they understood something fundamental. Life could be unpredictable, full of storms and surprises, but it could also be beautiful, fulfilling, and shared with someone who truly understood and cared. The storm had brought them together, but it was the days, the effort, and the quiet moments of connection that had built a life neither of them could have imagined alone. In the cabin, the fire flickered softly, casting a warm glow on their faces. Outside, the plains stretched endlessly, calm and serene under the moonlight. Inside, two people had found a home in each other, a home built on trust, understanding, and the quiet power of companionship. And in that home, for the first time in years, they felt truly complete. The ranch was no longer just a place of work or solitude. It was a place of beginnings, of hope, and of love that had grown quietly, steadily, and beautifully over time. And for Tom Gallagher and Emily, the world was now full of possibility, waiting for them to explore it together, hand in hand, heart to heart.